It might be time for y'all to shut up about free speech.
This is a world premiere. This is a world.
When we talk about free speech in the US, we're usually talking about the First Amendment to the US Constitution. And if you don't know what the US Constitution is, you're probably not alone. It's that dirty little scrap of parchment that gets trampled on by the government in their eagerness to cater to the needs of the political elite. You may know them as the 1%. The First Amendment is supposed to protect freedom of religion and freedom of expression from government interference. The right to freedom of expression is also recognized as a human right under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The right to freedom of speech allows individuals to express themselves without interference or constraint by the government. This specifically covers things like the right not to speak, certain types of peaceful protest, including refusing to salute the flag, or even burning the flag. But before you trolls get overexcited, not all speech is protected against interference from the government. Speech that incites action to harm others is not protected. Neither is distribution of obscene materials. Burning your draft card. The kids are like, what's a draft card? Look it up. It limits the rights of student expression through school-sponsored media outlets. Obscenity and the sale of drugs at school events. Now you kind of have to take this idea of rights being bestowed on the populace by the government with a grain of salt. While the Constitution was being drafted by a group of wealthy white dudes one hot summer in 1787, there were many people in this country for whom those 4 little pages would mean about diddly squat. Certainly not women whose rights weren't considered in the document, nor were African slaves. The 18th century concept of justice was an exclusively white male system of law and order. Also, working class people from the very beginning had some concerns. The Constitution makes no mention of labor, the backbone of the country, and neither does the Bill of Rights. But even white men should hold off on the celebration. Even though the government is constitutionally prohibited from interfering with free speech, it doesn't mean you can say whatever you want. The control of a society is not always just a function of the state, at least not directly. Informal control is the way the state can use messaging to the general public to instill certain values, like love for God and country. They can influence leaders on local levels through reward systems like government grants. They influence the education system. These values are often arbitrary and have nothing to do with fulfilling our basic needs. In fact, they often result in action against the best interest of individuals and entire groups. So even though we are free to say things against the state, the military, the flag, speaking truth to power, as they say, is usually prevented by informal social sanctions in the court of public opinion. So when a football player refuses to stand for the national anthem, there is a public outcry. So when anyone brings up a touchy subject or does anything that goes outside of societal norms, they can depend on some kind of informal social sanction. And that can be anything from being ridiculed or being run out of town on a rail. And if you don't know what being run out of town on a rail is, look it up. The First Amendment doesn't protect you from being fired from your job if you insult your boss. The First Amendment doesn't protect your favorite TV show from being canceled. It doesn't prevent YouTube from canceling your account if the company finds your content harmful. The First Amendment doesn't mean you shouldn't be afraid of some radical doing you harm for expressing your opinion in the media. Like when a member of the press gets a death threat for breaking a story, or when mosques and synagogues get burned down. Even illegal activity can deprive certain groups or individuals of their First Amendment rights. And for certain elements of the population, it's worth the risk of doing something illegal to shut certain people up. Especially if they're encouraged to believe that enough people will agree that certain voices should be silenced. Anyway, you may think I'm being picky talking about women's rights, slaves, the working class, and informal social control. You may be right, but in 1798, what's that, 10 years after the Constitution was actually ratified, President John Adams and the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Act. Look it up. But in short, these acts included new powers to deport foreigners and to make it more difficult for immigrants to vote. Sound familiar? Incidentally, and not coincidentally, it was the immigrant population that was contributing to the rise of the Democratic Republican Party, the party that later split to become the Democratic and Republican parties. In case you were foolish enough to believe they were two different things. The Sedition Act prevented public opposition to the government. It became illegal to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. You know, fake news! Remember when I said that parchment that gets trampled by the government, blah, blah, blah? It seems that freedom of speech has often taken a backseat in terms of government intervention. It happens especially during times of conflict. The most violent attacks against freedom of speech happened in the years leading up to the Civil War itself, and World War I. We saw an attack on freedom of speech in the so-called McCarthy era, when the nation was afraid of communism. People think of Vietnam War protest as proof of government acceptance of freedom of expression. But it didn't prevent the National Guard from firing on protesting students at Kent State. 4 students were killed and 9 others were injured. You don't think they were trying to send a message? Anyone interested can find books and journals full of examples of times when the First Amendment was disregarded to serve political aims. Just consider the fact that the US has been in conflict for most of its history. About 170 of the US's 241 years since 1776 have been spent at war and direct military action or engaged in some other violent conflict. That's almost 75% of US history where freedom of speech was likely taking a back seat in terms of the government. Our current time under our current president is no different. So when you're complaining about nagging SJWs or laughing about safe spaces on college campuses, you might want to give some attention to where the real threats against the First Amendment might be coming from. Not to mention becoming aware of other ways your civil liberties and your livelihood might be at risk. And direct your supreme trolling skills to where they might actually do the world some good. And even if you're not a troll, try spending a little less time on social media and a little more time writing to your politicians. We're taking to the streets and protests. Who knows, we might even see some real democracy as a result. I don't know, what do you think? Where do you see freedom of speech most under attack these days? Watch for more videos like this coming up, and please support me on Patreon. That's it for this video. Like it if you like it, share, comment, subscribe. This is Reg signing off. Love yourself. Peace.
And I love myself.